Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session in the Edgware United Adult Education Programme by Professor Irving Taylor, entitled Medicine in Biblical Times and Beyond. Irving is a well-known and distinguished member of our community. He is the Emeritus Professor of Surgery and a clinical teacher at UCL, and was Professor and Head of Surgery at UCL for 20 years. He is past President of the European Society of Surgical Oncology, the British Association of Surgical Oncology, and the Society of Academic and Research Surgeons. He was a member of the Council of the Royal College of Surgeons. He has published over 600 papers in peer-reviewed journals and is the author or editor of 34 books. For those with long memories, you may remember that he gave a well-received talk here almost 7 years to the day in May 2016 on blood and guts and Maimonides the physician. And tonight he starts much further back with medicine in biblical times, and I believe the and beyond may well take us to end with Maimonides. After the talk, he'll be available to sign copies of his newly published book, From Moses to Moses, a novel depicting a fictional account of the life of Maimonides. All proceeds will be donated to charity.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, Spencer. Actually, I should say I've actually retired from surgical practice some years ago, although I still teach at University College. And I actually sat down at Vice-Dean also a number of years ago. But, you know, it's an interesting thing about surgeons when they retire. I know a lot of retired surgeons all up and down the country. And one thing is almost invariable. They get involved in two separate activities. The first is the 3 Gs. Grandchildren, gardening, and golf. And the second activity is taking a particular interest in some aspect of the history of medicine, and especially the history of surgery, because it is such a fascinating topic. And I've also fallen into that trap. But my particular interest in the history of medicine goes back quite a long way, starting in biblical times and going all the way up to the Middle Ages, culminating in the life and times of my hero, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, the Maimonides, the Rambam. And so what I'm going to try and do in the next, 45 minutes, cover 5,000 years of history. So I would suggest you hang on to your seats because it's going to be a pretty rapid journey. So let's start off in biblical times. Yeah. Now, whenever you're thinking about biblical times, it's very important to have at the back of your mind some sort of timeline. There are many different timelines which have been proposed. This is one which I think is probably as accurate as you can get. So from Adam to the flood, 4246 to 4590 BCE, then the flood to Abraham to Joseph, then from Egypt to the Exodus, the wilderness period, to the conquest of Canaan, and then the judges and the monarchy. So those are the sort of time frames which we'll try and keep to. What better source than to look at this would be the Torah. But the problem with the Torah is that it doesn't contain a single reference to a human being being involved in healing the sick. And the reason for this, of course, is fairly obvious. Fortunately, Hashem was around to provide a fantastic national health service. He never went on strike and overall provided an outstanding service. And the sources to refer to this are listed here. We see in Bereshit, in Vayera, Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves, so they bore children. In Beshalach, in Shemot, Beshalach everybody knows because it's the Seder for the splitting of the Red Sea, but it also has a very, very important statement. If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord, Hashem, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. That sentence had huge ramifications and huge implications, and we'll come back to that a bit later on. And then finally, Hukas in Bamidbar. Now, Hukas is often called the medical Sedra. Make thee a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole. Anyone that is bitten, when he looked upon the pole, shall be healed. That is very, very important and represents an enormous contribution to how medicine was considered during that particular time. Actually, if you're ever in Copenhagen and go to the museum, you'll see a statue, a wonderful statue of Asclepius, who was the patron saint of medicine. He is with his staff and the snake curled round. And that particular staff and snake is used as a logo for many, many different medical societies around the world. And touching or looking at that particular staff was a form of therapy. He was a son of Apollo. He had two daughters, Hygeia and Panacea. And therefore, we get the name Hygiene and Panacea. There's a little bit of anesthesia in the Torah. Hashem caused an overpowering sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. He took one of his ribs and shut in flesh instead thereof. So in Bereshit, we see a little bit of anesthesia being introduced. If you come around to the time of the prophets, and particularly the time of the kings, there's a little bit of medicine in the Bible. In Ezekiel, you see the fruit will be used for food and leaves for medicine. And Isaiah talks about Hezekiah. Now, King Hezekiah had real problems with leprosy, as you probably know, and developed really nasty abscesses. Make an ointment from figs and spread it over the boil, and Hezekiah will recover. This is also repeated in Kings, when we see Hezekiah's servants spread the ointment over the boil, and Hezekiah recovered. And finally, in Isaiah, there was a lot of trauma in those days, covered with bruises, welts, and infected wounds, soothing ointments or bandages. Throughout that particular time, we read in the Bible various herbal memories are used. Myrrh, which is basically an analgesic, frankincense, which is an anti-inflammatory, and aloe vera is used for wound healing even to this very day. So if we can't really find any particular evidence for medicine in the Bible, no detail anyway, we have to think about other civilizations and what was happening during biblical period, let's say between 4000 and 1500 BC. There were many, many sophisticated civilizations, the Chinese, the Indians, the Mayan, the Minoan civilizations. But for the purposes of this particular talk, I'm just going to discuss three different civilizations. Neolithic, the Stone Age period, the Egyptian civilizations, highly sophisticated, and what was going on in Mesopotamia. We know a lot about Stone Age and times because of cave paintings. And if you think about the time between 4000 and 3000 BCE, the time, if you like, of Adam and Eve, the average lifespan at that particular time was 20 years. Compared to the lifespan of our forefathers, you can see there was quite a significant difference. There's no doubt that they relied upon so-called doctors who were really witch doctors who had treated patients with various ceremonies and various procedures. Certainly, Stone Age man had lots of herbs and plants, which I'll show you in a moment, particularly morphine and digitalis, and they carried out a number of surgical procedures, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Now, if you go to Stonehenge, you'll see the two circular sets of stones. Many of you will have been there. And generally speaking, there are two sets of stones. One, a smooth stone, where the water dribbles down and is collected and used as a form of medicinal content, used and provides a lot of powerful influence on individuals. So you have a smooth stone where the water dribbles down and is collected, and next to it, there's always a stone with various crenations, bits of the stone carved out. Those bits of stones are then formed as a bracelet, as an amulet, and again is used to ward off any disease. There are a number of cave paintings around the world, particularly in France, in Nazca, and in Spain, and some Central American countries. And basically, the cave paintings show various aspects which give some indication of how medicine was conducted in those particular days. Here we've got a witch doctor or shaman. You can see that caveman hunted animals And there are also various plants and herbs which are being collected over there. The other thing that the cave paintings show, first of all, here we've got obviously an animal, and you can see in the distance there's an encampment. And basically, the encampment was used to grow various herbs and flowers, which were then used for medicinal purposes. Here we've got an individual who's not very well. We can see that there's a dove there also, which was used as an indication for treatment. The herbs and flowers which were grown there are shown here in an encampment from just outside Lima in Peru, and basically it shows various herbs and flowers which have been fossilized, but were used in one of those encampments in order to grow for medicinal purposes. Some of the plants which have been, the seeds have been found, indicating use for both herbs and for various reasons. Juniper, hemp, you can see obviously grape and poppies are used for opium. There's a lot of trauma in those days, and how are wounds dealt with? They had an ingenious way of dealing with particular incisions and wounds using termites. Now, termites, as you may know, have a very strong jaw. And basically, the termite was used so that the upper part of the jaw was placed above the wound, and the lower part of the jaw was placed below the wound. The termite then contracted the jaw and approximated the wound. The body was then chopped off, leaving the head and the jaw in position, providing a very effective form of suture material. There was a certain degree of surgical intervention. Trepanation was very commonly carried out in Stone Age man. Basically, a segment of the cranium, a segment of the skull, was excised, presumably for mental illness, for epileptic fits, headaches, all sorts of reasons, to allow the evil spirit to remove. It's called trepanation. Now, we know that this was a procedure which was not only carried out, but the patient survived because samples have been taken from the edge of the specimen and show healing. Now, if healing occurred, it meant that the patient actually survived the procedure. And so it was obviously a thing which was carried out during life and was used very, very frequently. The actual scalpels that were used to carry out this procedure are shown here, stone scalpels, which were carved in such a way that they can be used effectively to carry out a trepanation. And here we've got a Stone Age man. Here we can see a patient lying there using his stone scalpel in order to excise that part of the skull. More recently, archaeological dig in Borneo identified a skeleton which was particularly interesting because it was a skeleton in which the lower part limb had been excised. Now, this was carried out in life, and again, samples were taken from the lower part of the limb, which showed healing, so that this young man had had an amputation of his lower leg carried out either for trauma or perhaps for some sort of tumour, showing again that there was fairly major operative procedures carried out during that particular period of time. So there you are. That's some of the things which are known in terms of carrying out surgical procedures as well as providing medication in Stone Age man. Egyptian civilization was really very, very advanced. And we know a lot about medicine during the Egyptian period simply because papyri and hieroglyphics were available. If we think about the Egyptian period during the time of Abraham, what do we know? Well, hieroglyphics have been developed and, as you know, can now be translated thanks to the Rosetta Stone, and paper was made available as a result of papyrus. The first named doctor was Imhotep, he was a vizier. He was a doctor to vizier to King Zoser. Many of you who've been to Cairo in Egypt may have seen the huge pyramid. There's a degree of specialization. Nairi was said to be the keeper of the royal rectum, obviously an expert in enemas. So they had a degree of specialization and the first named doctor. And here we have Imhotep in all his glory. This is a statue which is found in the Cairo Museum. The first named physician, the chief vizier to Pharaoh Zosha. There are lots of pyramids. Many of you have been to them. I've been to Egypt on several occasions. I'm always interested in going around various pyramids. My favorite one is the so-called Step Pyramid at Saqqara, which we had the opportunity of actually going in and visiting. The important thing about that is that adjacent to the actual pyramid, there's a cemetery and there's a wonderful carving there of a circumcision. It's a wonderful carving, as I say, of a circumcision, which is in the cemetery in Saqqara. You're not allowed to take any photographs, so this is taken from a book. But if you go to the Cairo Museum, you can see an actual painting of that particular carving. And this is taken at the time of Abraham, 2400 BCE. And here we see a member of the royal family undergoing a circumcision using a flint knife. Again, the Egyptians were involved with trepanation was being used in Egypt at the same particular time. The only difference was that they were using some form of mild anesthetic from plants which were grown from the cocoa plant. Didn't always work. This is a skeleton which was found in the Valley of the Kings. Basically, he'd undergone a trepanation. Unfortunately, the whole of the cranium had been split, and this guy died as a post-operative complication. The Egyptians actually modified trepanation by using a modified Black & Decker drill. Instead of taking large segments out, they were able to drill and make smaller holes, which was even still adequate to allow the evil spirits to be removed and dealt with epileptic fits and so on and so forth. Now, the reason we know all this is because they documented all their medical treatments using hieroglyphics and using paper which they formed from papyrus. Now, the papyrus are obtained from the stalk of the papyrus plant, which is found on the banks of the Nile. Basically, the stem is taken and split along its length and opened out. And as it opens out, it sort of expands as a sort of sponge. And they're laid both vertically and horizontally and then glued together. Even to this day, the actual glue that was used is really not known. But all the bits of information, almost a medical textbook, was written into these various papyrus. This is the so-called Edwin Smith papyrus, found by Professor Edwin Smith in 1906, and was taken and was written at the time of about 1600 BC, basically at the time of exile and the time of Moses. It contains 48 case reports of various conditions which were occurring in Egypt at that particular time: fractures, dislocations, clubfoot, dental decay, and various other disorders. And it also describes in detail the three divisions of healers. There were physicians like Imhotep, but there were also priests. The priests obviously dealt with problems by prayer. And then there were sorcerers, the magicians, who used various forms of divination and sorcery in order to achieve some form of healing. This is an Egyptian stone relief, again, found in the Valley of the Kings. And basically, it's interesting because it shows a guy here with a withered leg, almost certainly due to polio. And here we've got Isis, who's the goddess of healing, with a dove, and various medications here, all used to try and deal with this poor guy who's clearly got a polio. The other famous papyrus which had been found by Professor Ebers in Thebes again, roughly at the time of Moses, the time of exile to Egypt, there are 110 sheets of this particular papyrus have been found, which contains over 700 various forms of magical medicinal remedies. It also describes what they thought was blood circulation. They didn't realize that the heart had anything to do with it. It was thought to occur within the liver, and it's described in detail how the liver is responsible for circulating blood. Within it, we see a lot of herbal remedies. They describe all sorts of things. Animal substances such as lizard, which is used for baldness. Garlic is described as a valuable adjunct for heart disease. Honey, used for wounds. And never quite understand this one, but crocodile dung for intestinal disease. This is again found in the Valley of the Kings and is in the Cairo Museum. And basically, it shows a lot of surgical instruments which were used for various procedures, as various fistula probes, so on and so forth. There's this down here. I have an idea what that was used for, but perhaps we won't mention it at the moment. As you know, the main viziers, the main kings and pharaohs were all mummified, and many of these mummies have been looked at and dissected. This is one which is found in the British Museum here. This is a CT scan showing the lower limbs. The interesting thing about this is that you'll see adjacent to it is an artery. This is the artery to the thigh, so-called femoral artery. And the important thing about this is that it has atherosclerosis. In other words, it's a sort of a thrombosis within the artery, which shows that atherosclerosis, so on, are not necessarily disease of modern civilization, and they certainly are not associated necessarily with diet, since it occurred amongst the Egyptian mummies also. This guy is a vizier, is a barber to one of the kings, Pediamenet, and certainly had quite nasty atherosclerosis, and it's worth a visit to the British Museum just to have a look at him. There was an awful problem with mummies with dental disease. I know there's some dentists in the audience here, and I think you'd have trouble trying to deal with this problem, but 90% of mummies, again, dental problems are not necessarily due to modern dietary problems. They certainly occurred in Egypt, and they say the vast majority of mummies have had dental problems. This is Pediamenet again. Here's his skull in the British Museum, and he's got 2 dental abscesses also, again, indicating dental problems in that particular day time. Obviously, schlepping all the stones to make pyramids, which came from Italy, resulted in a lot of trauma, and a lot of mummies had fractures. Here we've got a fracture fracture which has healed in the radius in the lower arm. There's no doubt that they had a lot of experience in dealing with fractures. For example, here we've got a fractured femur, but they used various splints, used basically from reeds and date palms were used as splints to try and get healing to occur. Ulcers were a real problem amongst the Egyptians, I think probably because of leprosy. Leprosy results in ulceration because of lack of sensation, particularly in the lower limbs. Large ulcers form, and maggots were used. Maggots were then used to fill up the ulcer. The maggots secrete a substance which destroys and dissolves all the dead material, allowing nice granulation to occur so that healing will occur. I have to tell you, when I qualified in medicine in Sheffield quite a few years ago now, within the pharmacy there were medicinal maggots which were even used for, as I say, very same purpose. Nits were very, very common amongst the Egyptians. This is a nit picker which was found at the time of the Exodus. So, you know, I mean, the 10 plagues was a factor here, I suspect. Made a tusk without lice and the hair of the bread. And so this was an Egyptian nit picker. Again, showing more diseases which occurred amongst the Egyptians, which even are prevalent to this very day. So there you are. That's Egypt. How about Mesopotamia? What was going on in Mesopotamia during that period of time? Well, as you know, Mesopotamia was basically a cradle of civilization, a very fertile area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, with Babylon in the middle, where Abraham left Mecca came from. And this was a very, very advanced culture, simply because the land was so very fertile and the people lived incredibly civilized lives. As far as medicine is concerned, as far as treatment is concerned, within Mesopotamia, there were actually three forms, three types of individual involved with the healing process, involved with medicine. First of all, there were the priests who gained treatment using exorcisms and various incantations. The asipu, or seers, these were the magicians, if you like, sorcerers, and used various forms of omens and divination to treat and heal patients. Hepatoscopy was particularly common in Mesopotamia. Hepatoscopy basically, hepato is, as you know, is liver, but hepatoscopy, basically a patient was laid flat, an animal was obtained, the animal was slaughtered, the liver was removed, and the seer, by looking at the shape of the liver and the type of the liver, could come to a diagnosis and decide how the patient was to be treated. As far as prognosis was concerned, in Mesopotamia, they devised this particular scheme of thinking about prognosis by placing a bird in the temple. If the bird flew to the right side of the temple, the prognosis was good. If the bird flew to the left side of the temple, left in, for you Latin scholars, left is sinister, then the prognosis was poor. And that's where the term sinister comes from, flying towards the left. And then with the asu, or the physicians, used various drugs, surgery, bandaging was very, very common and probably developed to a great extent within Mesopotamia. Now, the person that always comes to mind thinking about Mesopotamia is, of course, King Hammurabi, who had an enormous influence on all sorts of things. One of the things he was particularly involved with was regulating medical practice and deciding exactly how doctors in particular should behave. And he was fairly strict. If a doctor has treated a free man but has caused a serious injury from which the man dies, then the doctor shall have his hands cut off. That was pretty serious stuff. The Code of Hammurabi actually was originally written using the cuneiform. Cuneiform language was the first language, the first writing that was devised within Mesopotamia. And the Code of Hammurabi was carved in stone. Here we have Shamash, who is the sun god, and here we have the cuneiform language describing various forms of laws and rules and regulations which the people must stick to. I say this piece of stone is in the British Museum, but the actual code weighed about 5 tons and was written at the time of the Exodus. A lot of other stuff in Mesopotamia was written using the cuneiform language on various clay stones. Clay was developed, cuneiform language, and here we have a Code of Hammurabi about 1900 BCE, during the time, slaves during the time in Egypt. That over 30,000 cuneiform tablets of this size have already been found. About 800 of them deal with medicine, as well as dealing with the laws and the rights of individuals. Various surgical conditions are described, how to deal with wounds, fractures, abscesses, and so on. This is a famous cuneiform writing on the clay tablet. This is again seen in the British Museum. And basically, it describes all the gynecological problems and treatment of gynecological issues. Again, this was written at the time of the Exodus. Other tablets, particularly, again, written at the time of the Exodus, round about the same time, using the same cuneiform writing, is particularly important because it describes all the different diseases which were present in Mesopotamia at that particular time. Smallpox, TB, sexually transmitted disorders, eye diseases, disease of the intestines, malaria. All these diseases were described in detail and obviously were present within Mesopotamia during the time of the Exodus. I mentioned bandaging. They were very keen on ensuring bandaging was done properly, and they describe techniques of bandaging in great detail. Also, abscesses. Abscesses were fairly common, and the management of abscesses is a surgical problem, and here we have draining of a surgical abscess on the limb. They use all sorts of various compounds really to deal with infections. Here we have dried fruits and dates, red ochre on linen and salt. All these were combined, mixed together, and used for various forms in various forms of body where infection was thought to be an issue. So there you are. That's medicine in those three different civilizations during the biblical period. If we now just fast forward a few hundred years and come to the next major development within medicine, we have to go to Greece and ancient Greek medicine, and of course that means Hippocrates. Hippocrates lived to the ripe old age of 90, lived from 460 to 370 BCE. Now, Hippocrates was a major personality for two reasons. First of all, he was the first individual to think about the cause of disease. All the things I've mentioned so far are treatment of symptoms. People recognize symptoms and try to treat symptoms. But Hippocrates decided there must be an underlying cause for these problems and devised the so-called humoral theory, which I'll come back to in just a moment. And this concept of humours and this theory lasted for something like 14 or 1500 years. He was also very involved with medical ethics, how patients should be treated by doctors and what the medical legal ramifications of this are. Primum non nocere, first no harm. And his principles, I think, even though they're several hundred years later, nevertheless, the principles that he suggested, in fact, apply even today, possibly even greater today. The importance of commitment to service. He was strongly against abortion and euthanasia. He emphasized the great importance of the doctor-patient relationship, the importance of a teacher, and the importance of clinical observation. Now, just going back to the so-called humoral theory, now you have to realize that from 400 BCE up to 1600 AD, in other words, a period of something like 1500 years, Hippocrates' theory on the cause of disease held firm. Nobody would contradict it, and there was no progress at all in medicine during this 1600 year period. Now, basically, what Hippocrates postulated was that the body consists of four different humours, four different substances: red blood, white phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Now, these four substances are in equilibrium, and while they're in equilibrium, the patient is well. However, if one of these substances either becomes too little or is too excessive, then disease will occur. So, for instance, if there's an excess of red blood, then this will result in heart disease, and therefore the patient should have a phlebotomy or bloodletting. Similarly, if there's an excess of black bile, this will result in melancholy, and therefore various treatments should be given. So it's all a question of four humours being in equilibrium, and if that equilibrium is adversely affected, then disease will occur. So if you think about heart disease, well, heart disease, excess of red blood, therefore phlebotomy or bloodletting should take place. And basically this meant sticking a scalpel into either the elbow or the foot and drain a couple of litres of blood in order to deal with it. But you can see the effect on the actual patients. They weren't usually too happy about that. Now, sometimes it was not possible to get into the vein to remove the blood, And so other ways of dealing with this was necessary. And this is where leeches came in. Leeches were used on the skin. This is the head of the leech, the tail of the leech, and blood is then sucked up into the body of the leech. And many of these leeches were placed around the body in order to achieve the same effect. In other words, reducing the so-called excess amount of blood which was responsible for that particular complaint. Now, the next person to mention is Galen. Galen was around roughly the time of the Mishnah. He was also Greek, but spent most of his life in Rome and became a personal physician to the Roman emperors. He had also a great influence on how medicine was practiced for many hundreds of years. He was clearly influenced by Hippocrates, and again, Hippocrates and Galen dominated medicine for some 1,500 years. He introduced the concept of measuring the pulse as a sign of illness. There was also a lot of stuff how he came to this conclusion, I don't think it's ever really known, but he thought that the liver and the heart would produce blood. He didn't realize the heart was a pump. He became an anatomist simply because he dissected lots and lots of animals, but he extrapolated what he found on animals to the human being and made a number of serious errors. He looked after a lot of the gladiators who were injured with sword wounds and whatever, so he was able to look very carefully at an anatomical dissection of a wounded individual, and so was able to make some conclusions about anatomy. The interesting thing is that during this period of time, about 500, really about the time of the Talmud, we see the beginning of ancient Hebrew medicine. And in the Talmud, there are in fact lots and lots of references basically to various medical procedures. Most of these I've discussed already: draining of abscess, trepanation, amputation of leprosy, binding of fractures, gangrene, bloodletting. All of these are found within the Talmud, because it was around about the same time as Galen, and were greatly influenced, obviously, by Hippocrates. Now, the one thing which I think is particularly interesting, that I'm reliably informed by somebody who knows a lot more than I do about the Talmud, that the apron, that this is the first time there's any reference to a surgeon wearing an apron, and it appears in the Talmud, and it's the first reference, as I understand it, to aprons being used for surgeons. As I said, from that period up to for about 1,400 years, absolutely no progress whatsoever in any aspects of medicine. 1,400 years of dark ages, which is quite remarkable when you think that every week almost there's some medical so-called breakthrough at the present time. But nothing happened for 1,400 years. And the reason for this was that there was very little science at that particular time. There were certainly no medical schools. And then we come to the opinions and the influence of the church. Now, the church in Europe forbid any form of dissection, and also have this concept from Bashalach, as I mentioned earlier on, the Sedra Bashalach, I will put none of the diseases upon you which I put upon the Egyptians. That was interpreted as that if you are ill, it means you're a sinner, and if you are very ill, you are a serious sinner. And so that disease by the church in Europe was regarded as a divine punishment, and the only form of treatment would be exorcism. Illness was thought to be caused by sin, so nobody bothered thinking about medicine for that long, long period of time. There were monasteries present which acted as pseudo-hospitals, but only dealt with prayer and exorcism and amulets and laying on hands, and they were really end-of-life institutions, and in no way were they involved in any form of active treatment. It was a remarkable situation right through to the Renaissance. Nothing happened with medicine whatsoever. Having said that, in southern Italy, they did actually have some activity. There was one of the first medical schools in the world was established in Salerno in Italy. But anything that was going on in terms of development of medicine, formulation of concepts and formulation of concepts was carried out by the Arab nations throughout the Caliphate. Very, very advanced. Outstanding physicians in the Caliphate, Razis, Abucasis, Avicenna, people who were thinking very deeply about all sorts of diseases and causes of diseases. In the Caliphate also were a number of Jewish physicians. All of them are particularly interesting, and all of them worked an entire life within Arab lands. And there were four very famous medieval Jewish physicians. They all followed Hippocrates, they all followed the humoral theory of Galen. Asaf Harofe, Shabtai Yoel Danilo, Yitzhak ben Shlomo HaIsraeli, and then, of course, Moses ben Maimon, which I'll come back to in a moment. Now, Asaf Harofe wrote his famous book, which was entitled Sefer Refuot, or Book of Remedies. It was the first book written in Hebrew, first medical textbook written in Hebrew, and provided a commentary on various forms of treatment for various diseases. And there's an extant copy of this in the Jerusalem Museum. Some of the drugs in use: mouse excrement, pulverized in vinegar, beneficial for alopecia; brain of the camel, if dry, prepared in vinegar, value against epilepsy; and earthworms, if pulverized and imbibed, will cleanse the body of a patient with jaundice. Not much of that is available on the NHS at the moment. In fact, in Tel Aviv, there is a hospital named after Asaf Harofe. The Asaf Harofe, which is part of Tel Aviv University. I've visited on a couple of occasions. It's actually a really very nice institution. And then there's Shabtai Danilo. Shabtai Danilo was born in Italy, but spent the whole of his time in Arab countries and moved to Baghdad. Interestingly enough, in his writings, he actually cites the Medrash. And I understand he's also mentioned by Rashi in some of his commentaries. Shabtai Danilo wrote Sefer HaYakar, which is again written in Hebrew, and talks about various medicinal roots which can be used as a form of treatment. And then there's Yitzhak ben Shlomo HaIsraeli, again worked virtually all his life in Cairo. He wrote about fevers, potions, and medical ethics, but he also wrote quite a long series of articles dealing with the urine. And he and his colleagues developed what's called a urinometer. Basically, this is a plate, and here we have a number of containers containing various fluids of different colors, and the patient came along with a sample of the urine in the bottle, and they compared the color of the urine with the various colors here as a template, and that gave a particular diagnosis. So that was him. But of course, they all literally pale into significance compared to Moses ben Maimon, the Rambam. Many of you will have seen this statue, I suspect, in Cordoba. He was born and bred in Cordoba. He was born on the 13th of April, 1135. At that time, Cordoba was the center of Jewish civilization, and Rambam's father was a rabbi within Cordoba. They lived under the Caliphate, under the Almoravids, who were a fairly benign group of Islamic leaders. As soon as they disappeared and the Almohadi came in, they insisted that all Jews left Spain, and so the Rambam and his family left Spain and travelled around left Cordoba, travelled various places around Spain before things got particularly difficult, and they had to leave, and they went to Morocco, as you may know. He went to Fez, where he went to medical school, the so-called Karawan Institute, where he studied and learned medicine and qualified as a doctor. Now, he spent all his life in Arab lands. He actually has an Arab name as well as Moses Maimonides and Moses ben Maimon. His Abdul Musa Imran bin Maimun, which is his Arab name, because he was revered also by the Arab population. He was a remarkable individual, not only as a key theologian, but also as a key philosopher, and also as a very distinguished physician in his own right, and in fact was appointed by Saladin as his chief physician to look after his palace, particularly when Saladin was away on his crusades. As far as his theological work is concerned, of course, the Mishnah Torah is an outstanding piece of work. This is an original segment which is found in the Ganitza collection in Cambridge. This is the Rambam's actual handwriting. I think he was probably left-handed, including some of the corrections he made. The Mishnah Torah is particularly interesting because, as you know, it's basically codified the entire Jewish law, the Torah, the Talmud, the Sifra, the Sefta. Took him over 10 years to write, but within it, because of his medical knowledge, there's a lot of medicine also. In Hilchot Deot, the laws of man, he gives recommended times for eating. He talks about the importance of exercise, the importance of a good sleeping habit, and also the importance of beneficial foods, of which a high fiber diet and avoiding fats is crucial. He probably may well be best known because of his the Marei Nevuchim, which is the guide for the perplexed. Here we have, again, from the Ganitza collection, in his own handwriting, corrections of a part of the guide of the perplexed. Basically, it's designed to deal with any contradictions that people may have between religion and science. It's an incredibly difficult thing to read. I've got 2 or possibly 3 different translations of, and I've tried on many occasions to work my way through it. It's very, very difficult to follow, but those people who can follow it regard it as, even nowadays, of outstanding merit. As you know, basically, to his own satisfaction, proves the existence of Hashem, a lot about prophecy, the nature of evil, the absence, basically, the absence of good, the Olam Haba, the world to come, and also resurrection. All these things dealt with in great detail and were followed by philosophers for many years afterwards. He also became the leader of the Jews within the whole of Egypt and also wider afield. And this is the actual original proclamation, again found in the Ganitza collection, Baris al-Yahud, the leader of the Jews' proclamation when he was made in Nagid. So he was basically chief rabbi, president of the board of deputies, president of the United Synagogue, all rolled into one. But in addition to that, he wrote an enormous amount. In fact, these are 10 medical textbooks which he wrote, which we use for many, many hundreds of years after his death. All of them are available, and translations of all of them are carried out. I should say all his writing, apart from the Mishnah Torah, was written in Judeo-Arabic, in other words, using Hebrew letters, but in Arabic, because Arabic was his first language. Obviously, I can't go through all these in detail, but I thought I might just show you just 2 examples of the sort of things he was writing about, to give you an example of his thoughts. He wrote a lot about asthma. Asthma was very, very common in his day, simply because of air pollution around the Nile. And he emphasized the importance of fresh air and clean water and a healthy diet. And this is the first mention of psychosomatic disease. He noted that asthmatic attacks were precipitated by stress and emotional changes, and psychosomatic medicine was devised following some of his writings. Sleep in upright position, avoid strenuous exercise, and during the acute attack, chicken soup, which in actual fact has a lot of antioxidants in, as you probably know, and avoid opiates. The other little bit of original stuff was his treatise on poison. Maimonides, in fact, was Saladin's chief physician, who looked after all his, not only Saladin, but all the people within Saladin's palace, of which there were some 2,000. But basically, Saladin got a bit concerned because on his crusades, a lot of his soldiers were bitten by poisonous snakes. And he asked Maimonides, has he got any solution for dealing with this? And this is where people reliably write about this, that in fact it was Maimonides who devised the technique of putting a tourniquet above the snake bite, and an incision into the snake bite, and then sucking out the poison and then dressing the wound. So I think that's possibly an original concept. But he wrote a lot, he had a lot of insight, I think, into medicine, and many of his thoughts, which were written in his textbooks, apply equally today. As far as the patient is concerned, take a comprehensive view of the patient and his circumstances in order to make a diagnosis of both his general condition and of diseases of individual organs. Treat diseases according to causes that bring it about. I think these are two very, very pertinent observations which are taught even to this day. As far as good practice is concerned, the physician should not treat the disease, but the patient who is suffering from it. Multi-physician consultation should be avoided. Too much specialization, and a bad physician is worse than none. And then finally, within the Mission of Torah, there's also a lot of very, very sensible comment. And I've taken these sort of 4 examples, which I find particularly appealing. Learning and studying medicine is an important form of divine worship. I rather like that. A healthy body is accordingly desirable not for itself, but only as a platform upon which the soul can strive towards its proper perfection. As you know, Maimonides considered our bodies are just basically a shell to ensure that our souls are kept pure. But we have a responsibility to ensure that our shells are kept as healthy and as well as possible so that the souls can survive as long as possible. And I think that's something which a lot of people, even nowadays, would subscribe to. I rather like this one as well. An understanding of science and philosophy becomes essential for an understanding of the Torah. In other words, a good secular education is absolutely crucial in order to really appreciate the Torah. And then this final one, again, what can one say? Torah, unaccompanied by labor, will in the end be rendered as naught. It leads to sin by becoming a public charge, and the man will eventually rob his fellow creature. It is incumbent on each Jew to earn a living. So there you are. Maimonides died on the 30th of December 1204 in his 70th year. His body was taken by donkey from Fustat, which is the old city in Cairo, to Tiberias. And many of you have been to Tiberias, I'm sure, have been to see his monument. His monument has recently been upgraded, and this is it. Within his monument, you'll see the tomb, which says basically Moses and Maimon, and it says that from Moses to Moses, there never arose a man like Moses. Now, I've had a great interest in Maimonides for really probably over 30 years now. And I've read many books, many books written about Maimonides. But the interesting thing about it is that all the books relate to the events around his life, his various publications. And it always struck me very odd that nobody had actually thought about him as an individual, as him as a man, as a family man, how he lived his life. And so I thought it would be quite amusing to put together a novel, a total fabrication and total fictional account of the life of the Rambam, taking into account all the things which are known about him. And I actually wrote this, and it's published, and it's available on Amazon. But what and there's some copies at the back of the room there, which I'll be happy to sign. What I'd like to do, and what I have done, is devote all the proceeds from the sale of this book to Hatzalah. Now, Atsola is one of the charities which I do support. I think it's a phenomenal organisation, not only for this country, but elsewhere, as you know, a phenomenal organisation. And I think as a community in Edgware, we're very, very fortunate to have them on our doorstep. And I believe it is important that we do continue to support them. So if anybody would like a copy of the book, I'll be delighted to sign a copy of the Rambam. And as I say, it will be regarded as a donation to Hatzola. So I just got, that's just 45 or 47 minutes. So I got through it in time. So thank you all very much. I hope you found it interesting.
The greatest boast nowadays for every parent is my son, the doctor. But if you read the Torah, there's no mention of doctors. And I suspect because healing was in the realms of Hashem. It wasn't our job to heal people. It was our job to placate Hashem, and he would heal us. Now, there must have been a time when that changed. So when were the first Jewish doctors arriving? And are you able to help us on that?
Well, Jews, you know, were never allowed to own land, never allowed to farm, never allowed to hunt. So they had to have some sort of profession to go into. So I think one of the reasons was that medicine was a desirable profession for doctors, for Jews to go into. And I think that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but I think it had an effect. But as you say, as I mentioned at the beginning, Hashem was dealing with all the medical problems of the Jews in biblical days, and there was no need for doctors then either.
So who was the first Jewish doctor?
The first Jewish, the term doctor, interesting enough, the actual term doctor, which is a Latin name, derived from Latin, I think it was about 500 or 600. They weren't called doctors, they were called seers or the various other terms. But the first Jewish doctor, I wonder if it was Asaf Harofe.
It's Luke.
Luke? Yes, indeed. Yes.
Luke, the physician.
Yes, you're quite right.
The heart deal.
Yeah.
To follow that up, since we've mentioned Luke, are there many references in the New Testament to medicine?
I'm sure there are, but I can't say I've really looked into any great detail.
I was just intrigued with that thing on one of the slides of a period when the population had a life expectancy of 20 years. So how did they not die out? Because they might have had children, but who would bring them up?
It's an average life expectancy. But this is in Stone Age man. Basically, a lot of archaeological digs have shown lots of skeletons of Stone Age from all over the world, whether it's Peru, Central America, throughout Europe, France, Italy. Lots and lots of archaeological specimens, and you know, they can now be dated. And the average date for Stone Age men, roughly at the time of Adam and Eve, averaged around about 20. But fertility issues are a different matter, actually. In fact,
You're talking about the first operation, which was obviously Hashem performing an operation on man and creating woman. Some might argue that was a botched operation, but that's a matter of it. But I wouldn't say that. Are there any examples that you've come across of very early operations where they actually cut somebody open to, say, remove an appendix or something else that and the patient may have survived? Are there any examples or theories surrounding that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, anesthesia was the real problem. Anesthesia was a real problem. Until the development of anesthesia, there was no real major operations carried out. But prior to anesthesia, there were reports, occasional reports of patients undergoing various procedures. Whether they survived or not is a different matter. But the first, I mean, the so-called laparotomy, the first operation to open the abdomen, was carried out in about 1832, and the patient didn't survive.
You know, if in cesarean, was Caesar really delivered by cesarean? Or is that just a story?
I think I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest that is so, but I'm not entirely sure.
Just to add a little bit of variety, as a retired dentist, I remember reading in a dental journal many years ago of a root canal therapy, and that was dated to 2,000 years ago.
Right.
You've got the actual tooth with a hole drilled through the back of it and some sort of needle-like rod sticking through the tooth. So dentistry goes back a long time. And we also know, again, going back to Egyptian times, that they would extract or remove teeth from slaves and using very thin gold wire, ligature them around the wealthy people in the hope that they could replace their dentition. It never worked, of course, but the dentist did okay.
So what's new?
I'd now like to call on Rabbi Stephen Jacobson to propose the vote of thanks.
Just firstly, I would like to thank Spencer for organising these adult education series. They're fantastic, and so a vote of thanks to Spencer, and also to Tony for the sound and the recording. So they're doing a great job. Just on behalf of everyone, I'd like to say thank you to Professor Irving Taylor, to Irving, for his very, very interesting talk this evening. It shows you that he's done a lot of research into historical medicine, and we've learned a lot this evening. It was very, very interesting, and we're very, very honoured and privileged to have a doctor of such outstanding sort of knowledge in our midst here in Edgware. So thank you very much, Irving, and thank you very much for coming.